The night they cast her out, not a single torch was lowered in her honor. Lyra had expected cruelty. She had not expected the silence. It was the silence that followed her through the iron gates of Ashenvale, that hung over the heads of the Pack Council like smoke that would not clear, that lived in the faces of the women who had once braided her hair by the lower hearth fires. Women who now stood at the settlement's edge, with their arms folded tight across their chests, and their eyes fixed somewhere slightly above her head, as if looking at her directly might make them complicit in what was being done. She did not weep. She had already done that. 2 nights before the verdict, alone in the windowless holding room, where they'd put her while the elders deliberated, Lyra had wept until her body had nothing left to spend. She had pressed her back to the cold stone wall and shaken apart from the inside, her wolf curling small and silent within her, too exhausted even to scratch at the surface of her mind. By morning the tears had dried. By the time the court doors opened and Elder Marin read the decree in that flat, practiced voice, banishment, effective by dawn, ordered by unanimous ruling of the Ashenvale Pack Council, Lyra had already assembled something still and impenetrable behind her eyes. She had stood up straight and said nothing. Her crime, as the council stated it, was simple. She had spoken against the Alpha's decision to carve away the northern borderlands, territory that had sustained Omega families for 3 generations, and sell the grazing rights to a rival pack flush with silver and ambition. She had stood in the open courtyard while the ink on the agreement was still wet, and she had said quietly but without flinching, "This land does not belong to you to sell." That was all. An Omega woman, speaking against pack law in public, against the Alpha's declared judgment. The council had deliberated for 2 days, not because the case was difficult, but because the proper wording of her humiliation needed to be thorough. They stripped her rank, revoked her shelter claim, burned the banishment seal into the inside of her right wrist while she held still and did not make a sound, and sent her north into the highland borderlands with the clothes on her back and a ration pack that would last her 3 days if she was careful. The gates of Ashenvale closed behind her with a sound like finality itself. What no one inside those walls understood, what even Lyra herself did not yet know, was what lay 12 miles north of where they had abandoned her. Before we continue, please hit the subscribe and like button and tell me which city you're tuning in from. I love to know where this story found you. Now let's dive in. In the fortress of Dravenmore, King Vorin had not desired a woman in 7 years, not from grief, not from loss. Those who whispered it that way were wrong. And Borvak, his second-in-command and the only man alive permitted to speak plainly to the king's face, had corrected that misunderstanding more than once at the war table. "It is not grief," Borvak had said 6 months prior, when the council had floated yet another suggestion of courtship. "A grieving man still wants. He just wants the wrong thing. Vorin doesn't want anything." The council had found that even more troubling. Vorin himself said nothing on the matter. He commanded. He ruled. He moved across the map of the Northern Territories with the quiet, absolute precision of a man who had reduced everything unnecessary from his life and felt no loss in the reduction. The fortress ran like a blade, clean, disciplined, without softness. The black wolf that had been his shadow since childhood paced the corridors beside him at night, the only creature in Dravenmore whose silence matched his own. 7 years had passed like this. On the night Lyra reached his border, a snowstorm was consuming the highlands. It had started as a low, pressing darkness on the horizon and built throughout the afternoon until the sky was nothing but white moving against white, and the outer forest sentries had doubled their rounds and lit the pretor torches twice over. Vorin was at the war table when the report came. A runner, breathless snow still melting from the fur at his collar. "A woman at the northern tree line, my lord. Barely conscious, unarmed. One of the sentries wants to know whether to leave her." Vorin did not look up immediately. He turned a stone marker over in his fingers once, twice, studying the eastern border notation. Then he set it down. "Bring her in." The runner blinked. "She carries a banishment seal, my lord. Ashenvale markings. Then bring her in out of the storm and bring me the seal." He said it without raising his voice. The runner left. Vorin told himself it was policy. No body at the border during a storm, regardless of origin, regardless of status. He told himself it was efficient. He told himself it was the same decision he would make for any stray creature found at the perimeter in a blizzard. He told himself this while walking to the lower hall anyway. She was on the floor when he arrived. 2 sentries crouched beside her, their torches throwing unsteady light across her face. Her dark hair was matted flat with ice. Her clothes were soaked through to the skin. Someone had wrapped a rough wool blanket around her shoulders, but she was still shaking. the kind of shaking that came from hours of cold, not minutes, the kind that did not stop quickly even in warmth. Her eyes were closed. Then, as if she sensed the shift in the room when he entered, they opened. She looked up at him, not with panic, not with the frantic performance of an Omega woman desperate to appear harmless. She looked at him the way a person looks at something they have already accepted might kill them, with a strange, exhausted honesty that held no manipulation and no theater, only the bare truth of a woman who had run out of armor and was no longer pretending otherwise. Her right wrist lay open against the stone floor. The banishment mark was still raw. Behind Vorin, the black wolf made a sound low in its chest, not a growl of warning, but something older than warning, something that had not come out of it in years. Vorin looked at the mark. He looked at her face. Something in him, long buried, long locked, convinced it had no further use, cracked open without permission. "Get the healer," he said quietly. "She sleeps under a roof tonight." No one questioned the king, and the black wolf settled at the doorway like a guard that had finally found what it was stationed to protect. Vorin did not sleep. He returned to the war table the same way he always did after an interruption, deliberately, without hurry, as if the interruption had already been filed away and forgotten. He picked up the stone marker he had set down. He studied the Eastern notations. He moved 2 border flags 2 inches west and noted the correction in the log. He did all of this with complete precision and very little awareness of what his hands were doing. Borvak appeared at the table's edge sometime around the 3rd hour of the night, a cup of something hot in each hand, and set one down near the king without asking. He said nothing for a long moment. He examined the map with the same squinting skepticism he gave everything, from battle plans to breakfast, and then he said, plainly, "You went down yourself." Vorin did not look up. There was a report. There are always reports. You don't go down for reports. I went down for this one. Borvak turned the cup slowly in both hands. Outside, the storm had deepened. The fortress walls absorbed it without complaint. Dravenmore had been absorbing storms for 400 years, and its stones had the particular indifference of things that have outlasted everything thrown at them. "She's ashen vial," he said finally. "Banishment seal, fresh one. I saw it. Council won't like it. The council rarely likes anything I do." Vorin set the marker down. "What is your point, Borvak?" Borvak looked at him with the flat, patient expression of a man who had served his king for 11 years and understood exactly when a question was meant to end a conversation. He picked up his cup. "No point," he said, "just noting it." He left without noting anything else, which was, Vorin knew, its own kind of comment. The council came at dawn. There were 3 of them. Elder Cassin, who managed diplomatic correspondence and wore his authority like a garment he'd had altered too many times. Lord Fenwick, who oversaw border agreements and had strong opinions about everything. And Councillor Dre, the youngest of the 3, and the most careful about which way the room was leaning before he spoke. They stood across the war table and delivered their concern in layered, reasonable language, the way men did when they wanted to appear measured and still get exactly what they wanted. The Omega woman, the Ashen Veil seal, the delicacy of interpack relations, the precedent it would set, harboring a cast-out, the risk of being seen as a shelter for exiles. Vorin listened to all of it. Then he said, "She stays." Elder Cassin opened his mouth. "Until I say otherwise," Vorin added, which closed it again. He did not explain. He did not offer a political framing or a tactical justification. He simply moved his attention back to the map, and the council understood, as it always eventually did, that the king had made a decision and the room for debate had already closed. Lyra woke to stone. That was her first impression. The ceiling above her was grey and ancient, cut from the same dark rock as the walls, fitted with the kind of careful precision that spoke of builders, who had expected the structure to last longer than they did. There were no soft furnishings, no decoration. A single torch burned low in an iron bracket near the door. A blanket, rough but heavy and warm, had been pulled across her. She lay still for a moment and took inventory. Her wrist ached. Her feet, which she could not feel when they brought her inside, had returned to something like feeling with an unpleasant insistence. Her throat was raw. Her body had the specific deep exhaustion of something that had been burning its last reserves for too long and had finally been permitted to stop. She was alive. She was inside. Both of those things were unexpected. A woman appeared in the doorway, older, compact, with a healer's efficiency in the way she moved and the way she looked at Lyra, not with pity but with clinical attention. She brought broth, a cloth for Lyra's wrist, and a spare undershirt folded over her arm. "You don't have to speak," the healer said. "Just drink." Lyra drank. She watched the room while she did. The proportions were military. built for function, not comfort but maintained with discipline. No dust, no neglect. The torch brackets were evenly spaced. The floor stones were worn smooth by years of the same boots walking the same routes. This was a place that ran on structure, on order. She filed that away. The healer checked the seal on her wrist without comment, applied a salve that dulled the ache to something manageable, and wrapped it in clean linen. She left without asking Lyra anything about herself, which Lyra appreciated more than she could have explained. She did not cry. She did not perform relief or gratitude, or the soft, readable helplessness that Omega women learned early could sometimes function as protection. She sat upright when she was strong enough to do so, and looked at the door and thought about what she had seen, and what it meant, and what she would do next. The healer's report reached Vorin before the second bell of morning. She's awake, took the broth, didn't ask questions, didn't weep, sat up on her own. Quiet. Vorin read it twice. Quiet was not unusual. Quiet was what broken people did when they had nothing left. But the healer, a woman who had treated pack soldiers, torture survivors, and battlefield wounded without editorial, had added one line at the bottom, unprompted. She doesn't seem broken. She seems like she's thinking. Vorin folded the report. He walked the east corridor an hour later, taking the longer route past the lower guest quarters for no reason he chose to examine. Outside her door, he stopped, not long. 3 or 4 seconds, perhaps, in which the corridor held no sound except the low pull of wind through the stone seams overhead. Then he walked on. Inside the room, Lyra opened her eyes in the dark. She had not heard him. There had been no footsteps, no door handle, no shadow beneath the frame. But something had shifted in the quality of the silence, a weight that had arrived and then deliberately withdrawn. And she had learned, long before Ashenvale had taught her anything else, that the things people did not say were usually more important than the things they did. She stared at the ceiling. The fortress breathed around her, ancient and cold and certain of itself. She thought, this place is not kind, but it is not cruel. And for now, in the arithmetic of her survival, that was enough. Nobody told Lyra she could move through the fortress. Nobody told her she couldn't either. On the third morning, she simply rose before the healer arrived, dressed in the spare clothes that had been left folded near the door, and walked into the corridor with the quiet, unhurried manner of someone who belonged wherever they happened to be standing. A sentry at the end of the hall looked at her. She looked back. He said nothing. She turned toward the sound of activity and followed it. That was how she found the healing chambers. They occupied a long, low-ceilinged room on the fortress's eastern side, lit by narrow windows that let in more cold than light, and lined with shelves that told the story of their management without a word needing to be spoken. Supplies stacked without system, dried herbs stored beside damp ones, contaminating both, wound dressings bundled with the used linens instead of the clean, a row of clay jars with contents that had been labeled years ago and not re-examined since. Lyra stood in the doorway for a moment, reading the room. Then she walked in and began reorganizing the shelves. She was halfway through the third row when the fortress healer, the same compact, efficient woman from the first night, appeared behind her. There was a pause. Lyra did not stop working. She held up 2 of the clay jars side by side. This one's gone sour, she said. Smells like the seal cracked over winter. And these herbs, the ones on the left, they've been sitting against the stone wall. They've absorbed the moisture. They won't hold their potency. The healer looked at the jars, then at Lyra. You know healing work. I know archive work, Lyra said, which is mostly knowing where things are, what condition they're in, and what happens when the wrong 2 things are stored together. She set the jars down carefully. I can help if it's useful, or I can go back to the room. The healer studied her for another moment with the same clinical attention she gave wounds. Then she handed Lyra a supply ledger and went back to her work without further comment. It was the closest thing to welcome Lyra had received in years. By the end of the first week, the sentinels had noticed. Not because Lyra sought their attention, she didn't, but because a man who came in from a border patrol with a gash along his forearm was treated faster than usual, with cleaner dressings and a poultice that actually drew the cold inflammation out instead of simply covering it. He mentioned it to 2 others. One of those 2 came back the next day with an older wound that had been closing badly. Lyra redressed it without ceremony and told him to stop using the standard pack salve on it, that the compound was too astringent for that stage of healing and was sealing damage inside instead of out. He stared at her. I'm not a healer, she said before he could ask. I just read. Vorin heard the reports. He did not ask for them. They arrived the way all fortress intelligence arrived, filtered through Borvac, who delivered information the same way he delivered everything, without decoration and without obvious editorial, though the selection of what he chose to relay was editorial in itself. The Omega woman reorganized the supply stores. Healer says it's improved efficiency. 3 sentinels have gone to the healing chambers this week who didn't go the week before. Vorin listened without expression. Is there a problem? No problem, Borvac said, just noting it. He had taken to watching her from the upper corridor. Not with intention. The upper corridor simply ran above the eastern courtyard, and the eastern courtyard was where Lyra sometimes stood in the late afternoon, when the light came in flat and grey over the fortress walls, not appearing to enjoy it, exactly, but standing in it, with a kind of deliberate stillness, as if she was reminding herself that the cold she was standing in was a cold she had chosen and not one that had been forced on her. She never looked up. She never performed her presence for anyone passing above. That was the thing he kept returning to. He came around the corner of the lower east corridor on the 6th evening and found her there, stopped at one of the wall brackets, adjusting a torch that had been set at an angle that sent smoke back into the stone instead of up through the vent channel. A small thing. The kind of thing that accumulated quietly into larger problems. She heard him. Her hands stilled on the bracket. He stopped. The corridor was narrow enough that the silence between them had a shape to it. She turned just enough to confirm what she had already known from the change in the air, who was standing there, and how close. And then she was still. He looked at her hands on the bracket, at the adjustment she had made. Something moved across his face that was not quite a question, and not quite recognition, but somewhere between the two. He opened his mouth. She waited. Then both of them, in the same breath, stepped back from whatever the moment had been reaching toward, and Lyra turned back to the bracket, and Vorin walked on, and the torch burned steadily behind him all the way down the corridor, drawing smoke cleanly up through the vent exactly as it was meant to. Word traveled the way it always did inside her fortress, not through announcements, but through the slow accumulation of whispers that eventually became common knowledge, without anyone being able to name the moment it crossed over. By the 10th day, everyone in Stravenmore knew there was a banished Omega in the healing chambers. By the 12th, they knew she was Ashenville. By the 14th, Eldercass had drafted a formal memo and placed it on the war table with the particular precision of a man who wanted it to be the first thing the king saw in the morning. Vorin read it standing up without sitting down, which meant he had made his decision before reaching the 2nd paragraph. The council convened anyway. Cassin led, because Cassin always led when the subject involved liability. The language was careful and abundant. Interpack sensitivity, the optics of shelter, the fragility of Dravenmore's current northern agreements, the dangerous signal sent to other packs when a king chose to house another pack's discarded. He spoke for 4 minutes without pause, which was, Vorin had learned, how Cassin indicated the seriousness of his concern. Lord Fenwick added that 2 border contacts had already sent in formal inquiries. Informal, he stressed, for now. Councillor Dre said nothing, which meant he agreed with the others, and was waiting to see if it would cost him anything to say so. Vorin let them finish. Then he said, "She stays," and picked up a different document from the table and began reading it, which was how he ended conversations he did not intend to continue. The council filed out. Borvac, who had been standing near the far wall in the specific way he stood when he was present, without having been invited, waited until the door closed. "Cassin's not wrong about the inquiries," he said. "I know. The Ashenvale Alpha is going to make it formal eventually. I know that too." Borvac was quiet for a moment. "You've been watching her." It was not a question. Vorin did not answer it like one. "There's something odd about her exile," he said instead. "A woman cast out for speaking against a land decision doesn't carry herself the way she does." "How does she carry herself?" Vorin set the document down. "Like someone who knows something." He was not wrong. Marit, the fortress healer, raised it with him directly, an unusual step that told him she considered it significant. She came to the war room doorway, which she had never done before, and stood there with her hands folded until he looked up. "The woman knows pack law," she said. "Not general knowledge, specific law, treaty structure, boundary clause language. Yesterday she looked at the supply exchange agreement from the Thornville Compact, the one pinned on the notice board near the stores, and she told me there was a land measurement error in the secondary clause that would have caused us a dispute in 2 years." Vorin was still for a moment. "Was she right?" "Borvac checked it this morning." Marit paused. "She was right." After Marit left, Vorin turned this over quietly. An Omega woman from a mid-tier northern pack, with detailed knowledge of treaty language and boundary clauses, who had been banished for speaking against a land sale, who refused to discuss her former home and changed the subject with the smooth, practiced ease of someone who had learned that particular skill deliberately. He sent for Borvac. "Find out what work she did in Ashenvale," he said. Before the banishment, he saw the bruise by accident. He was passing the healing chamber doorway, the upper entrance, the one that looked down into the main workspace, when Lyra reached past Marit for a supply jar on the high shelf and her sleeve pulled back. He had seen the banishment mark before, the circular seal burned into the inside of her right wrist, still raised and pink at the edges. He had noted it the first night and filed it as information. What he had not seen was the older bruising that lived above it, faded now to yellow and brown, the specific coloring of damage that was 2 to 3 weeks old. The shape of it was not an accident. It was a grip. 4 fingers and a thumb, pressed hard enough and long enough into her forearm to leave an impression that had outlasted ice, snowstorm, and 10 days of fortress warmth. Lyra pulled her sleeve back down and kept working. She had not looked up. She did not know he had seen. Vorin stood in the upper doorway and felt something move through him that was not concern exactly. It was older than concern, and quieter, and considerably more dangerous in what it was capable of producing. Whatever had been done to her was not simply the execution of pack law. It was personal. It was sustained, and someone had wanted it thorough. He was still thinking about this 3 hours later, when the rider arrived at Dravenmoor's outer gate, bearing a sealed letter pressed with the Ashenvale crest, requesting, formally and politely, the immediate return of their property. The letter was 3 paragraphs long and immaculately composed. Vorin read it twice at the war table, then passed it to Borvac without comment. Borvac read it once, set it down, and looked at it the way he looked at things he did not yet trust, with a stillness that meant he was still working. The council assembled within the hour. Casson had clearly already read a copy, because he arrived with his arguments pre-arranged, and his expression carrying the careful neutrality of a man who believed he was about to be proven right. He waited until everyone was seated before speaking. The letter, he explained, was from Alpha Crest of Ashenvale. It cited Dravenmoor's long-standing northern agreements. It expressed, in polished language, the hope that the relationship between the 2 territories would continue to be one of mutual respect and cooperative boundary management. It noted with regret that a member of the Ashenvale pack, a woman under active banishment proceedings, appeared to have taken shelter within Dravenmoor's walls without the knowledge or consent of her rightful pack authority. It requested her return at the earliest convenience. At the earliest convenience, Fenwick cleared his throat. The phrasing is careful, but the implication isn't. If we refuse, we're not just housing an exile. We're actively obstructing a pack disciplinary matter. That's grounds for a formal border grievance. It's grounds for whatever Crest decides to make it, Cassin corrected. And given the current state of the Northern Compact negotiations, the timing is not incidental. Dre, who had apparently decided which way the room was leaning, nodded once. Vorin had not looked up from the letter. He read it a 3rd time slowly, as if something in the language was worth examining at a different angle. Borvac spoke before he could. The letter doesn't mention what she did. The room paused. Packs requesting the return of a disciplinary exile always cite the violation, Borvac continued, in the flat investigative tone he used when he was thinking aloud and didn't care who heard it. It's standard language. It establishes jurisdiction. It says, "This is our matter, here is why, return her so we may conclude it." He tapped the edge of the letter. This letter doesn't cite the violation. It just says banishment proceedings. Proceedings, not conclusion. Casson frowned. The violation is on record with Ashenvale's council. There's no obligation to. There's also no reason not to if the violation is what they say it is. Borvac looked at Vorin. Someone wrote this letter very carefully. Vorin set it down. "She stays," he said. "Send a reply acknowledging receipt, nothing else." Casson opened his mouth. "Nothing else," Vorin repeated. Lyra was relabeling the clay jars in the healing chamber when Marit told her. The healer did it without preamble, which Lyra had come to understand was Maret's version of kindness. She delivered hard information cleanly because she believed dressing it up only made it worse. A letter had come from Ashenvale. The king had declined to act on it. Lyra's hands did not stop moving. She set one jar down and picked up another. "Declined how?" she asked. "He said you stay." Marit watched her. "I thought you should know." After Marit left, Lyra sat with the jar in her hands and felt the particular cold that had nothing to do with temperature. Crest had written, which meant he was watching for her, which meant the distance she had put between herself and Ashenvale. 12 miles of highland snow and one impossible act of being found alive was not distance at all. It was a pause. She knew what that letter meant. Not the surface of it, but the structure beneath it. She had spent 3 years reading Ashenvale's correspondence archives, organizing and cross-referencing treaty documents, learning the difference between language that was saying something and language that was hiding something. That letter was not about her rank. It was not about pack discipline. It was about what she remembered. Vorin found her in the eastern courtyard as the light failed, standing at the far wall with her arms folded across her chest and her eyes on the tree line. He had not planned to speak to her directly. He had told himself he was taking the long corridor route for unrelated reasons. He stopped beside her at a reasonable distance. She did not look at him, but did not pretend not to know he was there. "You were in the archives," he said, "in Ashenvale." A pause, yes. "For how long?" 3 years, treaty records. It was not quite a question. She answered it anyway. "Among other things." She was quiet for a moment. "I handled correspondence, land records, boundary documentation. I organized what came in and cross-referenced what was sent out." Another pause. "I was good at it. What did you find?" The tree line did not move. Lyra's jaw tightened slightly, a small thing that someone not paying close attention would have missed entirely. "I found that a land agreement had been altered," she said, "after it was signed. The version in the archive did not match the version that had been distributed to the affected families." She stopped there. Vorin waited. "I spoke against the sale," she said finally. "I told them it was wrong. What I didn't say, not publicly, was that I had seen the original. The courtyard held its silence." "Where is it now?" he asked. "I don't know," she said. "I left it where I found it. I didn't think I'd be the one leaving." Vorin looked at the tree line for a long moment. Then he walked back inside, went directly to Borvak's quarters, and told him to begin pulling everything they could find on Ashenvale's borderland transfers from the last 5 years, quietly, through back channels, without announcement. Something in that letter was buried, and buried things, in Vorin's experience, were always buried for a reason. Borvak's report arrived on a Tuesday, written in his usual compressed shorthand. More abbreviation than sentence, more implication than statement. Vorin had learned to read it the way one read weather, not word by word, but as a whole pattern. The pattern this time was troubling. 3 of Ashenvale's last 4 major land transfers in the northern borderlands had been processed through a single notary. An older man named Selwick, who had retired abruptly 18 months ago and resettled, quietly, in a village 2 territories east. 2 of those transfers had involved Omega family holdings that, according to adjacent pack records, should not have been eligible for open sale. The documentation authorizing the sales existed. Its origin did not hold up to close examination. Someone had built a very clean paper wall, and someone else had lived behind it for years without challenge. Vorin set the report down and went to find Lyra. She was in the middle of a crisis when he arrived. A sentry had come in from the outer wall with a deep puncture wound in his shoulder. A fall onto a post stake during the storm patrol, the kind of injury that looked manageable until it wasn't. The man was large, uncooperative in the specific way. Large men became uncooperative when they were frightened, and he had already pulled the initial dressing twice. Maret was working on him with the calm efficiency of someone accustomed to both wounds and difficult patients. Lyra was on the other side of the table. She was not assisting. She was managing him, not with force, not with authority she didn't have, with conversation. Quiet, specific conversation about the storm patrol rotation, about a structural weakness she had noticed in the eastern watch post last week, about whether the new grip configuration on the outer gate bolts was more efficient than the previous one. The sentry was talking back before he realized he had stopped pulling at the dressing. By the time Maret finished closing the wound, the man had given Lyra his full name and opinions on 3 separate subjects without being asked for either. Vorin stood in the doorway and watched the whole thing. When the sentry was bandaged and redirected, and Maret had moved to the supply shelf, Lyra looked up and found the king in the doorway with the composed lack of surprise she brought to most things. "You needed something," she said. "It was not a question." "Walk with me," he said. They took the upper corridor, which was long and rarely occupied at this hour. Vorin told her what Borvak had found. Not all of it, but the structure of it, the notary, the transfers, the documentation that existed without a credible origin. Lyra listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for the length of several steps. "Selwick processed correspondence for the Alpha's inner council," she said. "He had access to the treaty archive. I crossed paths with him twice in 3 years, and both times he was in a section of the records he had no administrative reason to be in. She paused. I noted it. I didn't know what I was noting. You would know now. I would know now, she agreed. Vorin looked at her. Your mother was connected to those borderlands. The corridor held the question carefully. Lyra did not flinch from it, but something in her face changed. Not breaking, just shifting, the way ice shifted when something beneath it moved. She held a small grazing parcel in the northern reach, she said, inherited from her own mother. It was not large or valuable, except that it sat between two plots that were. She stopped walking for a moment, then continued. She died when I was 15. The parcel was absorbed into general packland. I was told it was standard bereavement protocol for Omega estates without a male inheritor. And now? Now I think someone wanted that land specifically, and my mother's parcel was in the way. And bereavement protocol was a convenient mechanism. Her voice was level, controlled. But the control itself was the evidence of what it was containing. I think she may have known. I think she may have tried to protect something. And I think I spent 3 years working in that archive, without understanding that I was standing on top of the reason she died poor. Vorin said nothing for a long moment. They walked. I shut everything down 7 years ago, he said finally. It came out without preamble, which was not how he had intended to say it. But Lyra's honesty had a quality that made performance feel wasteful. After a betrayal during the border campaigns, I decided that wanting anything was a structural weakness. So I stopped. Lyra considered this. Did it work? Completely, he said. Until recently. She did not look at him. She did not offer sympathy or curiosity, or the careful flattery of a woman who understood she was being told something significant. She simply walked beside him in silence that felt inexplicably like the safest thing he had stood inside in years. He did not know what to do with that, so he said nothing further, and she respected the nothing, and they walked until the corridor ended. The man was waiting in the lower stores when Borvac found him just before midnight. Young, ashen-veil markings, but wearing civilian clothes, 3 sizes too large, and carrying himself with the compressed terror of someone who had made a decision they could not take back. He had a leather satchel pressed tight against his ribs. He asked for the king by name. He said he had documents. He said he had not been followed, but his eyes said he was not entirely certain. The informant's name was Pier, and he was 22 years old and had not slept in 4 days. Vorin could see it in the way the young man sat. Not the comfortable exhaustion of someone who had pushed through something difficult and arrived safely, but the rigid, humming alertness of a body that had forgotten how to lower its guard. He sat at the small table in the lower strategy room, with the satchel in his lap and his hands locked around it, and he looked at the king across from him with the expression of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times, and was now discovering that rehearsal had not adequately prepared him. Borvac stood near the door. The room contained no one else. Talk, Vorin said, not unkindly, just directly. Pier talked. He had been a records clerk in Ashenvile's administrative chamber for 3 years. Junior position, limited access, the kind of role that made a person functionally invisible in the daily operation of a PAX bureaucracy. Invisible people, Pier explained with the particular self-awareness of someone who had recently used that invisibility to commit an act of considerable courage, saw things that visible people did not. He had seen the original land transfer documents 18 months ago, while misfiling a correspondence batch. He had recognized immediately that what he was holding did not match the ratified versions on public record. The boundary measurements were different. The consent notations were different. 3 signatures on the original were absent from the distributed copies. And the affected parcels, he counted 7 in total across a 10-year period, all shared a specific feature. They were Omega family holdings in the northern reach, small individually but collectively forming an unbroken corridor of highland grazing land that, once assembled, was worth considerably more than the sum of its parts. He had photographed what he could with a small document lens. He had hidden the copies. He had spent 18 months being afraid, and then Lyra had been banished, publicly, cruelly, with a ceremony of humiliation that the Pack Council had clearly intended as a message. And Pier had understood that the message was meant for him too. Every person who had been inside that archive and looked too closely was a liability. He set the satchel on the table inside. 14 document copies, pressed flat. 3 original pages he had removed at personal risk. He did not minimize when describing it. A signed notation in his own hand recording the dates, locations, and document codes of everything he had accessed. And 1 additional item, which he placed last, separately, with a care that suggested he understood its weight. It was a single folded page, older than the others, the paper soft with handling. At the top, in small, careful handwriting, was a name. Correspondence of Mira, Borderland Keeper, Northern Reach Compact, archived for preservation, year 14 of the Elder Council. Mira, Lyra's mother. The page was a formal complaint, filed 14 years ago with the Ashenvale Elder Council, documenting a discrepancy in the boundary records for the Northern Reach parcels. It cited specific document codes. It named the notary, Selwick, as the source of the discrepancy. It requested a formal review. There was no record of a review ever being conducted. There was, instead, a record. Peer had found this separately, of the complaint being reclassified as administrative error and sealed from general access 6 weeks after it was filed. Mira had died 11 months later, cause recorded as winter illness. Vorin looked at the page for a long time. Then he looked at Peer, who had said everything he had come to say, and now looked like a man waiting to find out whether what he had done would save him or finish him. "You'll stay inside Dravenmore tonight," Vorin said. "You'll be safe." It was the only thing the young man needed to hear. His shoulders came down an inch. He found Lyra in her room, awake, which did not surprise him. He had the sense that she did not sleep deeply inside Dravenmore, not from fear, but from the vigilance of a woman who had learned that the moments she was not paying attention were the moments things happened to her. He sat down across from her and told her everything, slowly, without softening the shape of it, because he had the measure of her by now, and understood that softening would be its own kind of cruelty. She listened without moving. When he placed the folded page in front of her, her mother's name at the top, her mother's handwriting in the complaint notation, her mother's attempt at justice sealed and buried before Lyra was old enough to know what justice looked like. Lyra looked at it for a long time without touching it. Then she picked it up. The silence that followed was the kind that had mass. Vorin sat inside it without moving, without reaching for words that did not exist, without doing the thing people did when they could not tolerate another person's grief, which was to interrupt it with comfort that was really just a request for the grief to become more manageable for the observer. He simply stayed. Lyra read the page twice. When she set it down, her hands were steady, but her breathing had changed in the way breathing changed, when the body was working very hard at something it could not resolve physically. "She knew," Lyra said finally. "She filed it formally. She did everything correctly." A pause. "And they buried it, and then they buried her, and then they waited for me to find it too." "Yes. My banishment was never about what I said in the courtyard." "No." She looked at him. "They sent me out to die in the snow because I had read too much." "Yes," he said. "And they want you back for the same reason." The fire in the bracket burned low. Outside, the Highland dark pressed against the fortress walls with its familiar, indifferent weight. Lyra folded her mother's letter carefully and held it in both hands. And something in her face, which had been controlled and composed and quietly armored since the first night he had seen her on his stone floor, shifted into something older and rawer and entirely without defense, not breaking, but finally, after everything, allowing itself to be witnessed. Vorin did not look away. In the morning, he went to Borvac and told him to prepare the council chamber. They were going to bring it forward. All of it. Whatever came after, they would meet it standing. The council chamber in Dravenmore was not built for comfort. It was built for weight. The weight of decisions that could not be undone, of agreements that would outlast the men who made them, of truth spoken inside stone walls that had been designed to hold it. The ceiling was high and vaulted. The table was ancient oak, dark with age, long enough to seat 14. Torches burned at each corner, and the light they produced was serious and without flattery. Vorin had sent the formal convening notice 3 days prior. He had said only that a matter of borderland integrity required council attention, and that the presence of all Northern Compact representatives was expected. He had not mentioned Lyra. He had not mentioned Ashenvale. Alpha Crest arrived anyway with the confidence of a man who had been managing situations like this for 20 years and had not yet encountered one he could not reshape to his advantage. He was broad-shouldered, well-dressed, and carried his authority the way men did when they had never seriously had it questioned, loosely, as if its weight was not worth acknowledging. He took his seat at the table's midpoint and looked around the chamber with the pleasant, slightly bored expression of someone prepared to be patient through minor inconvenience. He had not yet seen Lyra. She was waiting in the anteroom with Borvac when Vorin went to her. She was standing. He had expected that. She was dressed in clean clothes that Maret had sourced from the fortress stores. Simple, well-fitted. Nothing that performed wealth or rank she didn't have. Her hair was back. The linen wrap on her wrist was fresh. She looked like what she was. A woman with nothing borrowed and nothing pretended, which was, Vorin had come to understand, the most formidable thing she could possibly be in that room. He looked at her. "You don't have to speak more than you're prepared to." "I know exactly what I'm prepared to say," she said. He believed her. The session opened with Vorin presenting the documents. He did it without theatre, simply laid the copies on the table in order, cited each one by origin and date, and explained the discrepancy between the archived versions and the distributed public record. He placed the original pages beside their altered counterparts and said nothing further. He let the difference speak. Elder Cassin leaned forward. Fenwick's expression had shifted from its usual diplomatic neutrality into something more alert. Even Dre, who defaulted to waiting for consensus before forming a visible opinion, was reading carefully. Crest's expression had not changed. "These are copies," he said. "Copies of documents from my pack's internal archive, obtained through means that have not been explained, by a king who is currently harboring an individual under active banishment from my territory." He spread his hands. "I'm not certain what we're meant to conclude from documents of uncertain provenance." "We'll address provenance," Vorin said. "Bring her in." The door opened. The change in Crest's face when Lyra walked into the chamber was small and fast. A contraction, quickly controlled, that told Vorin everything about what the man had believed would happen to her in the snow. She walked to the chair that had been placed at the table's near end and sat down without looking at Crest, arranging her hands in her lap with the composure of someone who had prepared for this in every room she had occupied for the past 3 years. Crest recovered quickly. "A banished Omega has no standing in a council proceeding," he said. "Her testimony carries no legal weight under Northern Compact law." "She's not here as a legal party," Vorin said. "She's here as a witness. Those are different things, as you're aware." Crest looked at him with an expression that had abandoned pleasantness and arrived at something harder and more honest. "This is irregular." "Speak," Vorin said to Lyra. She did. She began with the archive, her role, her access level, the organizational system she had maintained, the document cross-referencing that had been her primary responsibility. She described the day she found the discrepancy, the document codes, the filing location, the specific clause where the boundary measurements diverged. She named the parcels by their registered designations. She described the 2 versions of the Northern Reach Transfer Agreement side by side, from memory, with a precision that silenced every secondary conversation in the room. Then she placed her mother's letter on the table. She explained who Mira had been, what she had filed, when, to whom, and what had happened to that filing afterward. She spoke about the land her mother had held, its position between the larger parcels, the timing of its absorption into pack holdings. She did not raise her voice. She did not editorialize. She presented the architecture of what had been done with the same careful clarity she had once used to organize the records that documented it. The council was silent by the time she finished. Crest spoke first. "This is fabrication constructed by a woman with motive for grievance. The original documents are on the table," Vorin said, with a quietness that was more dangerous than volume. "The notary's name is on the table. The 14-year-old complaint is on the table. If you have a counter-document, place it beside them." Nothing came. The council deliberated for 40 minutes. Vorin stood at the room's edge and watched, letting the evidence do what evidence did when it was given adequate space, and people who were not entirely without conscience to examine it. The ruling was not complex. The falsified treaty was invalidated. Alpha Crest's conduct was formally referred for investigation by the Northern Compact's independent review body. The affected land designations were suspended pending full audit. It was a beginning, not an ending. Lyra understood that. She rose from her chair with steadiness, not triumph. Crest passed her in the corridor outside the chamber, while the council was still filing out. He stopped. He said, very quietly, close enough that only she could hear, "You've made something worse for yourself today. You know that." He said it without heat, which was the part that was meant to frighten her. He had not yet noticed that Vorin had come to stand directly beside her. The king said nothing. He simply stood there, and the black wolf, which had been waiting at the corridor's end, padded forward and positioned itself between Lyra and the door through which Crest would have to leave. Crest looked at the king, at the wolf, at the ground between them. Then he left. Lyra exhaled once, slowly. Vorin did not move away. The gathering was called a compact assembly, which was the Northern Territory's formal term for a meeting of pack representatives convened to address a matter of collective concern. It happened on the high plateau 3 miles east of Dravenmore, on ground that was considered neutral by long tradition, a wide, flat expanse of highland rock, where the wind came in unobstructed from the north and the sky sat low and grey and indifferent to human proceedings. 7 packs sent representatives. 3 sent their alphas directly. Crest came himself. Vorin had expected that. The investigation referral had moved faster than Crest had anticipated. That was visible in the way he arrived, with more men than protocol required, and the particular over-prepared energy of someone who had spent the intervening days trying to establish a narrative before the assembly could establish one for him. He worked the plateau's edge before the session opened, speaking quietly to representatives from the eastern and southern packs, hands moving with the measured expressiveness of a man deploying considerable charm at considerable speed. Lyra stood near the Dravenmore contingent in a wool cloak that had been left outside her door that morning, dark, well-made, with Dravenmore's iron clasp at the collar. She had not asked about it. She had put it on. She watched Crest move through the gathered crowd and felt the cold in her chest that had nothing to do with the wind. Borvac appeared at her left shoulder. He did not say anything. He simply stood there, which she had learned was his way of communicating that she was not standing alone without making it sentimental. The session opened with the Compact's senior elder presenting the review body's preliminary findings. 3 minutes of careful, procedural language that translated plainly to. The documents were real, the discrepancy was real, and the affected land transfers required immediate re-examination. There were questions. There were counter-arguments from 2 of Crest's eastern allies, both of which the senior elder addressed with the patient thoroughness of someone who had anticipated them. Crest let it run for 20 minutes. Then he stood. He was composed. Vorin gave him that. Whatever he had spent the past days preparing, it had not been panic. It had been strategy. "I want to be direct with this assembly," Crest said, projecting the reasonable burden tone of a leader, reluctantly correcting a misunderstanding. "What has been presented to this body originates from documents obtained through irregular means by a king who chose, for reasons I'll allow others to assess, to shelter a woman cast out by lawful pack process." He paused. "I do not question the king's intentions. I question the source. Because the source is standing in that cloak over there, a banished Omega with no pack, no rank, no standing, and every reason in the world to construct a story that serves her survival." Some of the assembled shifted, not in agreement necessarily, but in the particular discomfort of people who had heard a sentence they could feel was wrong, and were not yet certain how to say so. Crest turned slightly toward Lyra. Not fully, just enough that the gesture was readable. "She is not a witness. She is a woman with a grievance and a talent for records work, and a king who found her convenient. Whatever she told him, whatever she placed on that council table, it comes from a person who is, under compact law, nobody." He let that land. The wind moved across the plateau. Lyra did not look down. She looked at Crest, with the steady, documentarian calm she had brought to every difficult moment since the night they had burned a mark into her wrist and pushed her into the snow. The look of a woman who had already survived the worst version of this and knew exactly what she was made of. But she felt it. Nobody. The word with its full intended weight. Then she heard footsteps, not toward her, beside her. Vorin moved through the Dravenmore contingent, without haste, without announcement, without the performed gravity of a man making a political gesture. He simply walked to where Lyra was standing and stopped there, close enough that his arm was at her shoulder, close enough that every person on that plateau could see precisely and without ambiguity where the Lycan king of Dravenmore had chosen to stand. The assembly went quiet. Crest's expression did not break, but it changed, the way certainty changed when the ground beneath it shifted without warning. Vorin looked at the senior elder first, then across the gathered packs, with the unhurried directness of a man who had decided something and was not interested in how it was received. "Lyra of the Northern Reach," he said, and his voice carried across the plateau the way his voice always carried, not through volume but through the complete absence of anything uncertain behind it, "is under the permanent protection of Dravenmore, a beat, not temporary shelter, not political arrangement, not a matter under ongoing review." He did not raise his voice. He did not look at Crest. He looked at the assembly as a whole, and the distinction was its own statement. Permanent. By my word, by my name, and by the law of this compact which recognizes the authority of a pack leader to extend full protection to any individual within his declared territory. He paused once. "She is in my declared territory. She has been since the night I brought her in from the snow. That does not change. It will not change." Another pause. "Anyone who moves against her moves against Dravenmore." At the plateau's edge, the black wolf, which had been still as carved stone since they arrived, raised its head and bared its teeth. Not in frenzy, not in warning exactly, but in the way a thing that has been patient for a very long time makes clear that its patience has reached its natural end. The Eastern allies had stopped murmuring. The Southern representatives had stopped watching Crest for cues. Crest himself stood with Ian's mouth slightly open and a calculation running behind his eyes that was arriving visibly at an answer he did not like. The compact's balance of power did not shift with noise or ceremony. It shifted the way it always shifted. Quietly, irrevocably, in a single moment that everyone present would later identify as the one where everything changed. This was that moment. They walked back to Dravenmore as the light failed. The plateau emptied behind them. The council would deliberate further. There would be formal proceedings, land audits, months of careful legal work before anything was fully resolved. Vorin knew that. Lyra knew that. Neither of them spoke about it. They walked in the particular silence they had developed over the weeks since the night she and after had arrived on his stone floor. The silence of two people who had stopped needing words to fill the space between them. Because the space itself had become something they trusted. At the fortress gate, Lyra stopped. She looked out once at the highland dark. The same dark that had swallowed her when they pushed her out into it. The same cold that had been intended to finish her. She stood in it for a long moment, and it was just cold, just dark. Nothing with any claim on her. She turned and walked inside. Vorin fell into step beside her, and the black wolf came last, and the gate closed behind all three of them with the sound of something that had finally come home. She was no longer the girl left for the cold. She was the woman who had walked back out of it, and beside her walked the king who had looked at her once, across a stone floor in a snowstorm, and had not looked away since. He had wanted nothing for 7 years. Now he wanted only this, and in the long, quiet history of Dravenmore, that was enough. If you enjoyed the story, let me know in the comments. Your voice decides what I write next. Don't forget to subscribe if you want more moonlit love stories like this one.